Today's guest on the FOSSPod is Abbey Ripstra. Abbey is a human-centered design researcher who's worked at Salesforce, Instagram, and Cisco. But today we're going to talk about what it was like to do user experience work at the Wikimedia Foundation on software that's intended to be used by literally all of the humans.
Will, I'm sorry, I'm going to screw up your highly professional podcast intro.
Wait, what?
I have a deep, dark secret.
What's your secret?
I'm very excited. I'm very excited about the conversation we had with this week's guests.
Wait, you're pulling away the curtain. They don't know that we've already had the conversation.
Now I'm just screwing everything up. My deep, dark secret?
Yep.
I love to edit Wikipedia.
Like vandalize Wikipedia? That's not okay.
Come on, man. I only edit for good. Okay.
Okay. What pages do you like to get in on? Like the Kashyyyk page or?
Look, this is Wikipedia, not Wikipedia. Thank you.
Okay. What do you like to edit, Brad? Give me the juice here.
Keep that filth out of here. I don't make substantive edits. I don't make informational edits. I make what they call minor or trivial edits.
Ooh, I like trivia.
I like to fix typos.
That's it?
I also like to improve certain sentences for minor readability issues.
Look, I've added some Oxford commas before. I'm not gonna say I'm above that.
There's something nice about giving back in the smallest possible way.
Welcome to the FOSSPod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
As always, the FOSSPod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all of the value of open source to Google and all of the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more at opensource.google. Hey, Brad, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
You ready to talk about some cohorts?
Yes, I am ready. You ask me every week on the show how I'm doing, and I always say free and open, and I think I've officially run out on that one, so I'm going to have to come up with some new material. What are we talking about this week, Will?
This week, we are going to talk about user experience and user experience design and research, and we're talking with Abbey, who we introduced in the cold open, but she came and was willing to answer a bunch of very stupid questions from us and talk about her experiences working at Wikimedia Foundation on Wikipedia and projects related to Wikipedia. And also a little bit about what she's doing now at her, I think she described it as a very small design firm working on some really interesting projects. So yes. It was an opportunity for us to kind of dig into user experience research, which I don't think either of us had really done a whole lot of thinking about before, maybe.
No, it's a fascinating conversation, and I, not to steal too much from, she'll get into it in much more depth, but like I was really amazed to find out how investigative of a process it is, how much investigation. It's almost like you're a journalist in some sense, as she describes, like it is very much about teasing out what do people want to do? Like, how do they want to do it? What are the ways we can design something to facilitate what they want to do? Like, it's a fascinating approach to design.
And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is we talk a little bit about how do you figure out what people want when they don't know what they want, which is like, it's the thing that gets people upset at Microsoft for moving the position of the start menu or all of these different things that we've become accustomed to. It's the thing that people complain about when you go to Audacity and you're like, hey, it would be nice if the note-taking feature would save time codes in like time codes, minutes, hours, minutes, and seconds instead of just a number of seconds.
Oh, you mean then I wouldn't have to spend that half an hour this morning writing a little script to convert those seconds into legible times.
Yeah, exactly. But like this all kind of fits in the user experience. It's all the stuff that happens between your brain and the computer. And it's an interesting conversation. We talk about cohorts a lot, which are, if you aren't aware, a cohort is just a group of individuals having a statistical factor in common with a demographic study.
Yeah. I think that's probably the only jargon in here or term of art that we need to address in terms of research. I think most everything we discuss is pretty straightforward.
It shouldn't be super surprising that the user experience researcher was pretty in tune with how normal humans behave. So
I would imagine that communication is a pretty integral part of that job.
Anyway, I think we both learned a lot on this episode, and I think we both hope you all enjoy it and learn a lot as well. And I guess without further ado, let's get into like one of the many interesting projects that Abbey introduced us to.
The first product design assignment was to build a flashlight. And so the first thing I did was go and I decided, okay, I'll build a flashlight for firefighters. Could design it for whoever we wanted. And so first thing I did before I ever started to design anything was go and talk to a bunch of firefighters in Chicago firehouses and learn about how they use their flashlights. It was really interesting because the flashlights they were assigned by the city were all still sitting in their cupboards, in their lockers, ready for inspection. But they didn't use those flashlights at all because they didn't do what they needed in flashlights. So I asked them about, what do you use flashlights? It turns out they have all different uses for flashlights and different needs for the type of flashlights. So they would buy their own flashlights. They have to be in a, sometimes a fire is a gaseous, explosive environment. So you can't create a spark with a flashlight. So they had to have sealed flashlights, like dive flashlights. Also had to be waterproof, and it had to have a light filter that wouldn't reflect back at them in the smoky condition. So amber filter, also hands-free, because sometimes they're carrying someone out. Sometimes they use the flashlight to break through a window or some barrier that they need to get through. So the flashlights that they were given were not fulfilling all those needs. So I learned about all those needs, and then I started designing the flashlight. My design of the flashlight wasn't great. Like I'm, just learning to design, but what I would design and why for these firefighters was very laid out. And my professors noticed this, and they spoke to me and said, you're a design researcher. You should really focus on design research. And it was a shift for me because I thought I was going to be a product designer. But then once I started learning about design and learning about the various professions and roles that go into building things, to knowing what to design for whom and why, and then how to build it, I noticed my part. I was able to see, oh yeah, I have some natural abilities here. I'm an empathetic person. My dad is a safety engineer, so he taught me all about observation and human behavior stuff. And so that's how I got into human-centered design and how I got into being a design researcher.
So the terms that you see in the space a lot are user interface, and then more recently, user experience. And, like UI is something that we've been seeing since, the Windows 3.1 days back in the early 90s. Graphical user interfaces, GUI is a term that just about anybody who's a giant computer nerd is familiar with. Could you help demystify what the differences are between UI and UX? Are they synonymous in any way? Can you help us understand what the differences are?
So I think of user interface as the technology that serves as a go-between between humans and the technology that's code. It's the way the human can direct a software to do something or receive something that it does. User experience is the experience of using that software, of how do I experience using Audacity, or how do I experience using Salesforce's software. As a human being, no matter my technical capabilities, am I able to do X, Y, Z workflows? There's also, there's user interface, UI and UX, but there's also design thinking, design research, visual design. There's a lot of different roles and methods that go into building software that humans can use. I mean, the technology to make the software go is a very different experience than what people who aren't technologists experience it in using that software. So there's the back end and the front end. They all have to work together. And without the humans, why would we even build the software? I mean, I know there's software for software, but
we're getting there, right?
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of times these days people bundle user interface and user experience together. I think mainly because they both start with user. I'm not sure.
And they're acronyms, and it's yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it's a place where, especially in the open source world, I don't want to say people aren't aware of it, because the people that I know that work in open source are definitely aware of the shortcomings in terms of user experience. But I feel like there's a kind of general vibe among a lot of, especially even large projects, they don't know how to make it better.
Yeah.
There's a fundamental difference between making software that works and making software that works well for people. Like, we see a lot of software that works and that you have to learn how to work. And the number of times I've encountered software as a user that I just don't have to think about and I kind of intuitively know how to use it. I think I'm a pretty good computer user at this point in my career. It seems like it requires a real shift in, like, an organizational focus and shift and desire to make that happen. Do you have good examples that you can think of, or how people made those shifts, or are there case studies people can look at? Or it's a big question, I know.
What gets built for who and why, and how it gets built is a team effort. So there's priorities, right? Is it a priority to make it usable by people, or do we need to push the product out the door tomorrow? So it does take a little more time. It takes time, and it takes prioritizing experience. I guess it all depends on, what is the project? Who's the audience you're designing for? Wikipedia, it's for everybody. So it needs to be usable by your daughter and my dad and everyone in between. So in that case, it's pretty important to consider how people are going to be able to use it or not. When you're talking about a financial software that a firm will use with people who are expert in that type of work, it may not need to be as broadly usable. It may need to be just focused on that group of people. So I think it's a strategic decision about how much effort and resources you put towards making a product not only work technologically, but work for humans.
This seems like one of the biggest arguments in favor of increasing diversity in the software development world. Like, this is the things you're talking about are real tangible benefits, not just from hey, it's better to make technology accessible to everyone, but hey, if I address more humans, then I can sell my thing to more humans potentially, right?
Yeah. Well, and then there's the other part about, the team that's building the software. And a lot of times, like, design researchers working over here, maybe working closely with design, but then the engineers are over here and the product managers are over here. To really do a good job of user experience, like, the researchers have to be working alongside the engineers and working in tandem. And a lot of times design research goes into a report, and that's where it dies. You maybe make a presentation and maybe make some bugs, or like, we're going to improve this feature, make it more visible, findable, discoverable. But if we can build a system so that the engineers and the product managers can understand what we're learning from people as we go and what are the findings, then that research isn't going to go to die somewhere. It's going to be able to be used, and the engineers will take it into consideration as they're building. Because you can't just say, hey, engineer, make it this way. They need to also know why, just like the designers need to know why to understand what to do. So I think it's a group effort, and that we need to be able more clearly to share the research and the whys of what we're designing and building.
Are there any other types of research that you conduct besides the kind of field research where you're bringing people in and kind of querying their feelings and perspectives on things? Or is there like another field kind of back in the office that you would engage in this process?
Yeah, I think in general you can kind of think of design research practices in two groupings: evaluative research and generative research. And generative is the kind of research that you were just referring to, like a contextual inquiry, or trying to learn in a broader sense what people need, want, what their challenges are. And then there's evaluative research, and that's before you have an idea what to build, before it's kind of understanding who to build, what for, and why, the generative research. And then
all of the questions.
Yeah, all of the questions. And hopefully you have a team of not only design researchers, but designers, engineers, PMs to participate in that research and bring all that information in to make the decision about who to build for, what, and why. But then there's evaluative research, which is once you have some concepts or even a product to test, you need to evaluate that idea against the needs and goals and challenges of the people you're building for. And a good example of that is usability testing or concept testing, where you're testing out the concept, you're testing out the product, the functionality, and getting feedback on that. And there's, you can do rapid iterative testing where you're working in tandem in a very agile fashion with the product team to test and iterate and test and iterate. And then you get to refine as you go. And the benefit of that is before you put something into production, but sometimes in open source, you put it right into production and you can change and iterate as you go. I mean, there's all kinds of debate about which is better. You test to the degree you can before you put it in production, or wait. It's different in different contexts, but you'll save a lot of refactoring or rebuilding if you test and get the obvious stuff taken care of, like bugs and I can't find that button and things that are pretty easy to fix, before you put it in production. Because once it's in production, it takes a little bit more, it takes more time, and you might inconvenience people if you have to fix it. There's more fixes and patches to do. So evaluative research, it's sort of the different needs, different outcomes.
It seems like a lot of your job is still putting yourself in the user's shoes and knowing when you're able to do that and when you're maybe not positioned to do that, right?
Yeah. It's a very tricky consideration. It's something to think about very carefully, because I essentially can never actually be in someone else's shoes. So the skills are really more about careful listening and empathy and observation, and actually inviting people to share their experiences and their needs and their goals, and having them participate in the design rather than operating extractively and like trying to take and actually get in their shoes. I never will be able to, but I'll be able to hear and see patterns from people and learn from groups of people about what is needed for this group of people or these individuals.
I was just going to say, one of the things I found working in software and in games is that people often say they want one thing when you ask them, but when you watch them use the software, they're actually looking for something that's completely unrelated to the thing that they want. How do you separate what people ask for from what you determine people need by watching them and paying attention to them?
Well, many times I just don't ask what they want. I ask what they need. And there's some backwards engineering to that, because if someone says, I need X, they may be thinking about a product. For example, like if you're in a giant big box store and you see a person staring up, they're like trying to get that thing up there. They can't get it. There's no ladder. There's no person to help them get it. You might ask, what do you need? And they might say, I need a ladder. But actually what they need is that thing up there on the top shelf. And they're offering the solution to me of, I need a ladder, or I need a dirigible to float up there, or I need someone to lift me up, or whatever it is. Those are all varying solutions that might work for them, but might not, considering not only their need, but the context that they're operating in and the resources available to provide that solution. So there's always some backwards engineering. And the way I do that in research is just asking why. Why do you need that? Why do you need that ladder? Oh, I need to get up there. So then, ask why. And you usually can drill down to the actual need, but it's a translation. It's a iteration and checking in to make sure you've heard right.
You need like a 3-year-old on staff to just keep asking, but why is the sky blue? Why, on and on and
Yeah,
on.
sometimes I feel like a 3-year-old. Always asking why. It can be annoying to people.
So how did you get from product design research to, I guess software is products, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how did you make that jump?
Well, so in grad school, my mindset was, I don't want to work in software. I want to work in the physical world, and I want to build environments and know what people need more physically. I was not in the mindset of going into software, and so I turned down some interviews because I don't do software, which was strange. But what ended up happening is I got an internship here in San Mateo in California at a place called Jump Associates, which, because I'm a design researcher, they do a lot of design research, and I had an internship there for 6 months, and then after that was ended, I worked for a short time at a toy company and learning all about product development stuff. But then I wasn't able to use my skills there necessarily. And I was looking around, and one of my close friends who was also a designer, he said, hey, there's a job at Cisco Systems that I think you should apply for and I think you'd be great at. And I said, yeah, but I've never worked in software. I'm not sure, but software is a product, just like a flashlight's a product, just like a shopping cart's a product. So he's like, all your skills are transferable. So I just went for it. I applied and I shared my expertise and I got the job. And I ended up working at Cisco Systems for about 2.5 years, and I kind of got my toes wet in software. And then I moved over to Salesforce. And then after about 2.5 years there, someone sent me a job to be not the first design researcher, but to establish a design research practice at the Wikimedia Foundation. And that was very exciting to me because after working in for-profit context, I was very excited to work at a mission-driven organization, to be able to more clearly understand the benefit that I was contributing to for the world, because it's very direct, right?
Yeah.
And being the sum of human knowledge, and what Wikipedia does for the world it's pretty understandable and direct.
If you want to think about how important Wikipedia is for the world today, ask a 10-year-old. Show them a set of Britannicas from 30 years ago and ask them what they are. And the answers are amazing because they have no idea. Like, my daughter looked at one and said it was a phone book. And I was like, no, oh, sweetie. Well, I mean, close, but no cigar. Working at Wikimedia, you were working on an enormous piece of software that in the form of the Wikipedia and the associated sites. What was the process like starting there and bringing that whole effort, helping bring that effort online?
Yeah, it was super intriguing, and I learned so much, because one of the big differences between working at an open source project versus a for-profit project, let's say, the power structures are very different. For example, when I was working at Cisco or Salesforce, no customers can turn off the features. But at Wikimedia, the community, since everything's open source, many people are contributing to building that site and that project, it's all open. If the Wikimedia Foundation produced a functionality that the community was opposed to, they can turn it off. And that was like a trial by fire that I experienced and learned a lot from in my first month working there. One of the product teams had built a product called the Media Viewer. And if you imagine a Wikipedia page, there's the article is the main focus, but there's also images, photos on some of the articles. And a while ago, when you would be reading an article, you click on a picture. Maybe if you're a reader, you just want to zoom in and see the picture better. It would take you to another website called Wikimedia Commons, where you would see the image larger and you could download it and upload it and do all kinds of things. And there was all the metadata, where else was it used and who had contributed that picture. But then you kind of have to get back to the article. So we wanted to fix that experience. I think the motivation of the product team was to fix that experience for readers.
So they knew there was a problem, but it seems like the scope and shape of the problem was maybe also another problem they didn't even know they had.
Yeah, they weren't considering necessarily all the users, all the kinds of users that were interacting with that image, that media. So they were solving the problem for the readers. And, we built Media Viewer so it would keep you in the article and it would just pop the image up. But then it didn't take you to Wikimedia Commons, which is fine for the readers. But for curators and people who are contributing those images and checking the attribution, which is very important, and all the metadata and understanding where did that picture come from, that broke their workflows. And that was why those users' needs weren't necessarily considered in that first design. So what we needed to do was go, and the product was turned off. It was a big issue, a big concern of community, and we heard and listened, and we had to turn it off for a little while. And then I did a whole bunch of interviews of curators and people who were upset about the product to understand how to provide for their needs as well as to improve the experience for readers. So building a product, you might be focusing on one user, but there might also be other users that are using it the same way but have different workflows that are necessary to consider.
I mean, I guess at Wikipedia, you'd have what? You'd have the readers, you'd have the creator, you'd have the writers, the editors, the curators, the people that work at Wikimedia Foundation, presumably.
Yeah.
And then also this massive international audience too, right?
Well, there's like 300 Wikipedias. There's all different language Wikipedias. So each Wikipedia has its own community. And there's contributors, there's curators, there's people who are working in the community to kind of monitor and it's not monitoring, it's like curating, it's editing.
It's like moderation.
There's
almost,
moderation,
right?
Yeah, because for every Wikipedia article, there's also a talk page. And so that's where contributors and authors discuss the article before they add the content. Hey, are we sure about this? Like, can we write this? Like, do we have the right citations to support this assertion? And the community conversation can get tough sometimes. And so there's moderators who are there moderating, and there's rules for the community, and there's, ways of behavior. And so there's all kinds of rules. It's a socio-technical system, and it's social as well as technical. And that's kind of hard to perceive when you first step in as a new person. It's hard to reach that community. So yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of users in Wikipedia and frankly, in most products.
So I guess there's two problems. Like there's an iterative loop where you have different versions and you put it in front of people and you kind of watch them use it. And then you take that feedback back to the engineers.
And the designers
but
too.
When you're starting out with this, like what should be the scope of this? Like, how do you figure out what the initial needs are of the users before you have a scoped out product, presumably?
So we did a large research project, a contextual inquiry, which means you go to the context, you go to the place where the users you're trying to learn from, the people, the human beings you're trying to learn from are, and you learn about them and their needs in that context. And our questions were about new editors learning to edit, because there was data over years describing how Wikipedia was not retaining new editors. People would come in, create an account, and maybe edit once and then drop and never come back. 94% of the new editors were just dropping and never coming back. And this is a very crucial problem, because there's goals to make the content equitable and available for everyone. And if you have just got a certain core of editors, that is reflected in the content. So we want to make sure, so the project survives and is equitable and is open, that we can invite many different people to participate. So though there was quantitative data saying these editors are coming and leaving and not sticking around, we didn't know why. There's many cultures and people from many places contributing content. Wikipedia in South Korea is more local. There are people in diaspora who are contributing to Korean Wikipedia who don't live in Korea, but most of the editors are from around that area. All the wikis are their own. They're all very different. There's 300 of them. How do you understand them? There's big ones and there's medium ones and there's small ones is one way you can categorize them. And the big ones get a lot of attention. And, since it's open source, many research scientists and data scientists can use that data. And so there's a lot of research done specifically on English Wikipedia. And as the Wikimedia Foundation, an organization that is supporting all the wikis, we decided we should focus on some other medium-sized wikis that don't get as much attention and focus. So we went to South Korea and Czech Republic to learn how those two communities, those wikis, were inviting and supporting new editors, to try and understand what are the challenges of new editors? Why are they dropping off? Like, what are they trying to do? How can we better support them?
Like, did you go to people's door and knock on your door and say, hey, are you Magnolia fan? I'd like to find out why you stopped editing after you did this one edit.
No. What we did is we looked,
best.
Since it's open, we could see, accounts that had started and dropped. And so we reached out to people. So we wanted to talk to some people from those communities who are experienced editors and who were kind of trying to grow the community and teaching people to edit. So we talked to a few people like that. We also looked in the wikis and sent emails to people who had created an account and then dropped. And we also sent emails and inviting them to participate with us to learn from them about people who had started, maybe edited a little bit longer than that first group and dropped, and then just some people who just kept going. So we wanted to learn from those specific people because they had the experience that we were looking to understand. And the other people who were more experienced, they could help us understand the context and the culture of that particular wiki, because each wiki has its different community and different challenges and stuff. So that's how we found the people to learn from. And what we were asking was things like, what's your experience like in trying to edit? We would try to be as broad as possible and then have them show us and tell us about their experiences. What were the challenging things? And have them show us how they tried to edit and what happened. Tell the stories about, I just made a small edit and it got deleted and I don't understand why. So one of the major findings we observed was that Wikipedias as socio-technical systems, it's difficult to understand the socio part as a new person, as a new editor, because you're going in and you're working in an interface, and though there's a talk page, it's hard to understand how to use. I think they're fixing talk pages to make them more user-friendly, but it's hard to really connect with the community, because when there are curators and people who go and review, vandalism is a big problem. So there's AI that will look and decide 85% that's vandalism, and it gets, reverted. But then there's this area where maybe it's vandalism, maybe not. So humans have to look at a queue and edit and maybe delete that, or maybe send a note, hey, you need a citation, or there's a whole curatorial process. But when you're a new editor, you don't understand all that stuff. You don't understand the interactions that other human beings are having, and also how to learn and how to go get help if you have questions, or you don't understand why did that get deleted. So we saw a lot of examples of that, and you can see the report online. That's one of the great things about working in an open source project, that we got to work in public, and there was no hiding our research or keeping it secure for IP purposes. So you can see all those findings, and what we did with those findings was work in workshops with the designers, some representatives from the communities we had learned from with engineers, with product managers in the Wikimedia Foundation product teams, and even communication designers and people in the programs department and community engagement department, to define programs, products, communications that would help people address those challenges we saw, and help them move towards their goals. So it's not always a product, right? Sometimes it's a communication, sometimes it's an awareness campaign. But we ended up, a whole team was established. So we did this whole process, and we had the findings, and we had to bring them home and make sure everyone on the team that we were going to address these challenges with understood the findings and understood the stories we were bringing home, to make sure they could have empathy for those new editors too. And then we dove in and started getting ideas for how to address it, and then evaluate those ideas. And then a whole team was established to support new editors, and they built, products and supports for new editors, and focusing in those communities, working with the communities to design those.
If we could roll back to the beginning phases of some of the research projects you've done,
okay.
When you're first assembling the group of people that you want to conduct research with, how do you determine the minimum number of people, and also, how you get people with a diverse enough range of views on the subject to get relevant, kind of statistically relevant results that are useful?
Yeah. So most of the work that I do is not statistically significant. There is two types of data. There's qualitative data and quantitative data, at least that I've used in my research. The quantitative data, for example, is like 94% create an account and leave.
It's something you can measure.
Yeah, it's something you can measure. And then the whys are the things that are really hard for quantitative data to get, right? The human behavior part, like, why are people not staying? Why are they leaving? So because it's a certain cohort of people, there are people who have tried to edit and didn't edit. That reduces the numbers of people we might want to talk to. So that's that group. But then we need to get a representative sample. So we decided to go to 2 Wikipedias to get different context, different understanding of both Wikipedias. And so we wanted to see 2 different communities so we could kind of compare. One, Czech Republic, had very strong community support for welcoming, training, teaching new editors to participate in the experience. But the South Korean community had less funding, less people participating, and they weren't able to support new editors as well as the Czech Republic. So that was one thing, like, what's the context? There's different contexts. And then it's also, a recruit is very challenging because, you might get 1% response. So we would send out 400 invites to brand new editors and get, 4 people to reply. So you have to go big numbers to get a small number. And For the different methodologies in design research, you need different numbers of people. For example, usability studies, 5 to 7 people is a good number because there's diminishing returns in what you're going to learn about how people can go through a workflow. And you need to have the right people. Like, you don't want to test with people who would never use that product. You want to have the right kind of people that you're building for to test the product. But for something like this, like a contextual inquiry, you need larger numbers to be able to see patterns across a cohort of people. And if you're trying to address more than one cohort, then you need that many more people. So this was the cohort of brand new editors, people who are within this Wikipedia. They've come and gone. So we tried to get a good rounding of different kinds of editors in each of those. So we spoke with probably 30 people in each country.
Oh, wow.
So we did a lot of interviewing.
Are those like hour-long interviews, or is it that they sit down, they come into the office and sit down in front of a computer and they go for a half a day?
No, it's usually an hour to an hour and a half. And there's preparation to do ahead of time. You know, we need them to sign a consent form to choose the kind of information they're willing to share. And if they wanted to share it publicly or just with our team. We also ask their permission to work with them and ask, would you like us to come to your house? Do you want to meet at a cafe? Please bring the technology that you use. So one of the things about contextual inquiry that is a benefit is that we can see how people work in the context that they're living in and that they're working in, because that has impact on how they use the software, the whatever product we're building. And many times that's kind of forgotten, but that's a really important information that we can learn by seeing what context and what kind of interactions people are having as they're learning to edit. So we would go maybe meet in a cafe and they would show us how they edit. We would talk, get to know them. They could ask us questions as well as us asking them questions. There would usually be 3 people from our team, 2 or 3. There's one person who is the interpreter. And I don't say translator because it's not just about language, it's about interpreting culture, language, and the community around, in a sense.
Yeah.
And then there's a local researcher. Whenever we do a contextual inquiry or research in a community that we're not part of, it's very important to find local people to be the kind of the point person in those interviews. Because as an outsider, like I had never been to Seoul before or Korea, and I, as a person who lives in San Francisco, I have my context. I carry with me biases. And I don't know, I think it's important to have someone local to interpret and help us understand and check our biases. If the participant always gets to choose, like, what's your language of comfort? Would you prefer to speak in Czech, or would you like to speak in English? In South Korea, people would be much more comfortable speaking in Korean. As a person who doesn't speak Korean, I would go and I would take some notes about the context and stuff, but then we were doing translation. So the researcher who's doing the translation and the interpretation would ask questions to the participant, and I could see what they're doing on their machine if they were showing us something, and then she'd translate it back to me and I'd take some notes, and I may ask her a question, then she would ask, so that we had to be very careful to set up a context that's going to help us understand the person's experience and, to the best that we can, reduce the biases of our perceptions and our understanding. And one of the ways we did that was there would be 3 teams. It was a team of 7 for each of these contextual inquiries. We'd go out in a day, 2 or 3 teams, go do 2 or 3 interviews each, like an hour each, traveling around, and come back, have our notes. We'd type our notes up, and then we'd all do a debrief together. Like, well, we had 3 interviews. We talked to this person. This is what the person's about. Here are the challenges they've had. Here are the goals, what they're trying to do. Here are some of their important experiences. And keep in mind that we have a framework this whole time of the questions we're trying to answer. What do we need to know to better support this constituency, this group of people? So we had these big frameworks of Post-its in the hotel room or wherever we Airbnb we were staying in. And as we do the debriefs, we're like putting up Post-its about this person and their experience. And we're starting to see patterns, and we're starting to build ideas of what we're learning. And the interpreters would be part of that, and our local researchers were part of that, and we were all part of it. So it's that much more information that we're gaining and reduction of our biases to the best degree that we can.
It seems kind of bonkers to me that you're talking to a few dozen people to discern their intent on these decisions that a piece of software that 1 billion people use?
Yeah.
That's an incredible amount of pressure, Abby.
Yeah, I guess that gets back to my question earlier of how do you know when you have enough data and enough people, enough different perspectives?
Well, you start to hear the same thing over and over again is what happens. In my experience, it's better not to say in the beginning, we need to talk to 30 people to make this understanding. We're going to talk to as many people as it takes to get to that understanding. And usually it's different in different contexts. Speed is an issue, right? And one of the things that I've experienced in my profession is in some organizations, speed is more important than actually doing
like thoroughness,
deep research, right? And so sometimes okay, we can only do 12 interviews, and maybe you'll get to some patterns. You could do that depending on the breadth of what you're trying to understand. But the answer is it's qualitative research, and you start to see patterns. You start to hear the same thing over and over. And you're also talking to a specific cohort of people. It's not all those billion people, right? It's people who've tried to edit and gave up. Maybe they stuck around, but they had challenges. So that's reducing those billions by a lot.
Multiple orders of magnitude, like
yeah.
a tenth of a percent at some point, I assume, right?
Yeah.
You've also done some international research in more kind of emerging markets. I believe you've been to Nigeria and India, specifically places where access to the internet is not as steady or ubiquitous.
That's right.
What was the genesis of those projects, and how did you select those territories, and what was the goal there ultimately?
The origins came from a conversation I had with my boss at Wikimedia Foundation, Toby Negrin. He and I were standing in front of a poster that had the Earth on it, and it said all the humans, and it was in the Wikimedia office, and that's the audience, all the humans for all the Wikipedias. It's all the sum of human knowledge. We were both standing there staring. He's like, how do we do this? It's all the humans. And so we talked about how, yes, it's all the humans, and we can make it manageable by thinking about groups, but different audiences that we're going to work with. And the easiest way to think about it at that moment was editors and readers. And then you can break it down into experienced editors, new editors, and there's all the wikis. But we knew we had a lot of contact with very experienced editors, specifically in North America and Northern Europe, that very vocal people who knew how to connect to the foundation and make assertions and communicate. But then there's all these people who are new editors who maybe don't even know that the Wikimedia Foundation exists and that they can make requests even. And then there's many billions of people who are readers who we just have no way of connecting with, right? Beyond going out on the street and talking with them. But if we go out in the street in San Francisco, that's a very different audience than across the world, right? So the foundation decided we need to learn more about readers and understand how to better serve them, how to invite more people to read and to learn about Wikipedia. And so we had many conversations with the different departments, like, well, if we're going to learn about readers, where should we go? And one of the goals of this kind of research was to connect with audiences we didn't have that connection with, like we had with the North American and Northern European editors. So after many conversations, part of the consideration was there needs to be communities, Wikimedia communities, in the places we go so that we can work with them and they can connect us and we can learn about their experience and support them as well as learning about the readers. We wanted to understand the different contextual experiences like internet access, different economies, different societies and cultures. After many conversations, it was decided we'd go to India and Nigeria. And so that's what we did. We did a lot of planning and headed out.
And this was a reader focused or editor?
It was called New Readers. And you can also see the results of that. It's type in new readers Wikimedia Foundation or MediaWiki. And we worked with a firm called Reboot for both new editors and new readers who are experts in contextual inquiry. And they also had an office in Abuja in Nigeria and connections with local researchers in India and Nigeria, which, as I've said before, is crucial to doing this kind of work, to work with local people.
So what happens if you get that part wrong, I guess, is the question. What, you pollute the data with your perceived biases, or?
That's part of it, but also you're going to learn a lot less because there's no real way to check your biases. There's no real way to, like, we got to be able to speak the language. If I don't speak Hindi, because it's not just about language or just the context. There's culture. There's so many human factors to consider. There are so many things I learned, like from coming from San Francisco, where pretty much we have internet access 24/7. Now, I know not everybody. There's a major digital divide, and that's a big problem. But there's a bigger gap in other places where, for example, many of the people that we interviewed in Nigeria, they have internet not all day. It's like a couple hours a day. It comes and goes. Electricity comes and goes. Access to the internet comes and goes. So it's a very different behavior. It's a different, people would save up their internet time for when it's accessible. And so one thing that happens there is if I only have 2 hours online, I'm just going to do the most important things to me. It's going to be less entertainment, maybe more entertainment, but there's different choices you make when you have different access. So understanding those contexts and the reason why those contexts would be a lot harder if I just went in by myself and started asking questions. And it's a little less respectful also. Like thinking I would be able to understand that on my own.
Fascinating. Okay, so you want to build for all of the humans. You have your places you're going to go. How do you start thinking about what questions you're going to ask? With the editor project, it seems a little more straightforward. You're like, hey, you know that you want to find out why they stopped editing. With this, it's a much broader question.
Mm-hmm. We defined those questions even before we decided where to go. So the question we decided to go in with, the broad question was, what kind of information are you needing and looking for, and how do you get it? We didn't ask about Wikipedia. That was the main thing, like, getting to know people, like, what do you do, and who's your family, and what do you do, what's your day like, and then what kind of information do you need, and how do you get it? And a lot of the times the answer is I talk to my uncle, I read a book, I get online, I go here, I go there, and in the conversation, maybe Wikipedia comes up, maybe it doesn't. And if it does, we would dig in and understand, what's that doing for you, But then if it never came up, we would have the little logo, the globe, and say, have you ever seen this before? Like, oh, it looks familiar, but I don't know. And then we, just digging in more about how do you get information, where do you go? Say, hey, do you mind showing us your browser history? Could we, see what are the places that you go? And they'd show us, and there's Wikipedia.
Even if they had no idea that they were going to Wikipedia.
Right, and part of that was a lot of people use Google to find information all over the world, obviously. And so type into Google something like, I don't know, giraffe, and then it just goes in the search results. You can see, giraffe. And you click on it, it goes right to the Wikipedia article. It doesn't take you to the front door of Wikipedia. It just takes you to that article, and the design language of Google and the design language of Wikipedia, which is the content is front and center and there's white space, looks very similar. So many people were thinking that Wikipedia was Google. And so we made a small design change once we brought that back to the foundation. That was only one of the 31 findings that we came back with. But a quick fix was to, when you go to the article, that there's a little, there's a search bar at the top when you get to that article on your mobile phone, because most of it was mobile phones, right? Most people were using mobile phones in these contexts, and some that worked, some that didn't. But anyway, put a little ghost of the word Wikipedia in the search bar, so then it would at least give a little clue that, hey, you've moved to a different site now.
Well, so I was going to ask some pointed questions about open source because that's what we're here for, kind of. Coming into this large open source project, did you find that there were specific challenges? Is there a culture of not? It doesn't seem like there's a culture of not caring about user experience. It seems like more that people don't understand kind of where to start or where to kick it off or how to do this. And talking to you, more than anything I've done in this space before, has made me understand that it's a nuanced and complicated goal. There aren't shade tree UX researchers for a reason, I think. So like if people are interested in getting better UX in their open source projects, do you have recommendations for things that they can read or where to start or resources or people they can talk to, or like where do you start with this, I guess?
One thing I would suggest to any firm is any open source project is to think about the proportions of engineers that you have to designers and design researchers. There's a pretty low proportion of design and design researchers to engineers in many open source projects. So that's one thing you can do right away. But then there's not the roles to hire, or maybe, people aren't volunteering. But there are basic things you can do to kind of step out of the shoes of the engineer and into the shoes of the user. It's really pretty hard to do that just by imagining it. But if you do some basic usability studies, which as far as all the methodologies that I've learned and practiced over the years, contextual inquiry, like I've been describing, is very complex. It's a lot of moving pieces. It takes time to learn. But a usability study is something you pretty easily learn. And you just have to be you don't want to lead the people through showing them, here's the button to push. You want to, just observe people using the software you've built and make sure you find the right people to do the testing, the people that you're building for. Because from my experience working with engineers, I'm not an engineer and I don't play one on TV, but from learning from engineers, it's really hard for an engineer who's built the system, who knows how it works, to get in the shoes of a user who doesn't know how it works. So if you can watch and ask people to show their experience and make them feel comfortable and say, I want to learn from you. I want to understand your experience. Then you can really learn a lot about what's working in your software and what's not. Just basic usability things. There's a lot of stuff you can learn just from talking to 5 to 7 people or observing them using your software.
In game testing, we often tell people, if you find something, if you can't figure out how to do something, it's not your fault, it's ours, which makes them feel comfortable, and then they'll keep trying things, and it leads them a little bit, but in a way that's encouraging rather than discouraging or bad. I
say that kind of thing all the time, even to my parents who are in their 80s and they're technologically savvy, but sometimes it's frustrating. They might get upset at themselves or frustrated with themselves. I'm like, no, it's not you. It's the design. Yeah. It's the way it was built. It's not you.
Look, I've threatened to rent my parents out to Apple's UX design research group.
That's a good idea.
I would love to know more about TrimTab and find out what you're working on and how people can find out more about you.
Okay. Well, after working at Wikimedia Foundation for maybe 5.5 years, and I moved on from there. And then I work at Instagram for a little while. And I think that at this point in my career, I decided I want to do work that's going to have positive impact on the world. And a lot of the work I did in all my jobs did have that impact. But I wanted to be able to make the decisions about what to work on. So 2 partners and myself, Christina and Ruben Rode, we decided to band together and create TrimTab. And we want to both have a good experience in working as employees, as partners, and also work for organizations that are doing really great in the world, but they don't necessarily have design chops in their skill sets. So one of our clients is a client called Entidad. They're an engineering firm, and their client and our client is the United Farm Workers Foundation. And we're building immigration services software so that the staff at the foundation, who are attorneys at different levels and people who work with immigrants and people who are applying for status in the United States, to make their applications. So DACA recipients and DACA renewal and naturalization processes. And COVID did something, it did a lot, but like for this particular context, it made it so everything got shut down, just like in many contexts. And so that immigration work had to keep happening, but they had to kind of move online and move to do that work remotely. But before that, it was all pretty much paper, and people had to go to the offices physically, back and forth, making it laborious for both the people who are applying and the people supporting them. So COVID kind of gave a chance to, hey, we tried this online, and here are things we learned about what it works to do remote work versus in person. And so our work is to work with the staff and the people who are the clients, the people who are immigrating and applying for status, to understand what they need in the software that we're building. So we gather requirements by talking to people about what's your workflow. We started working with the staff first, because they see the whole picture of what needs to happen in this process, to understand what are the processes, what are the tools you're using, what are the challenges, what are the things that work, how do you collaborate together. And when we joined Entidad, they had already started. They had a really good start on understanding the user experience. So we joined and we started designing and building. And now, as we have one part of the workflow, we'll do testing with the staff. They get an account and could you go through this workflow? And we observe and talk with them, and like, oh, this thing is missing, this isn't. So that's one of the things we're doing, is bringing the folks who are going to use the software, who we're building for, into the design process, into ensuring that we're building something that's going to be useful for them, that's not going to break their workflows, but it's going to make it easier. Like currently they're using several different softwares, so they have to go from one to another and another to communicate one and another. And then we're going to just, hopefully our goal, make it a lot easier, reduce the friction in their workflows by building this software.
And that audience, I have to imagine, from the people who are trying to immigrate, like they're nervous about putting stuff into computer. Like if they're used to working in paper and they're accustomed to going and talking to an attorney or their advocate, then you're asking them to put in the form and they're like, oh, this is all going to be a database someplace. Is this going to end up backfiring and get me in trouble at some point? It seems challenging.
Well, I think that's for some of the people, perhaps. I don't want to speak for the whole group of people.
Of course.
But I think some folks feel comfortable putting content in, but frankly, it is an emotional experience from what people have described. It's, you could get deported, and that's a very frightening thing. And some of the questions that were asked in the forms and from USCIS are, what's your criminal history? When did you immigrate? And, there's a lot of questions that could raise anxiety. So that's one of the things that we're thinking about, is all the human factors, not just can you accomplish this task, but how does it feel to accomplish this task? And how can we make it easier? What would make it less anxiety and less stressful for you? One of the things we found in a recent study is that, as DACA recipients filling out the renewal form, they're feeling anxious. Where does this information go? Exactly like you said. And so one of the things that we did is shift our terms of service and our, we gave a note. We decided we're going to put a note in the beginning that says, you're going to have a meeting with staff at the foundation. You'll get to talk over all this with them before it goes to USCIS. So hopefully that will help people feel more comfortable and less anxiety ridden about entering their information, and so that they know where that information is going. I think that's a very important thing across many products, in not just in this particular context, but anytime we're entering data and doing stuff online. At this point, we don't even know where it goes half the time. You have to do a lot of research, and you have to be able to read legal language to understand. So that's, I think, an important thing to be transparent about. But that's kind of getting off.
We're recording this at the close of tax season, and I can definitely commiserate with people who feel anxiety at filling out forms online.
Yeah, we're taking a course from this organization called Humanity Centered, and it's a seminar, and it's a very critical look at our industry and the equity and lack of equity and inclusion and diversity, not only in the people we're doing research with or designing for, but in the people who work in the industry. So we're taking a very critical look and trying to understand how can we address the ethical issues we observe and bring a more ethical practice to the work. And there's all kinds of challenges we all experience in working in industry, and also the participants we do research with and the people that we want to have test our software. There's issues there too of it can be an extractive process. It can be a very challenging and uncomfortable experience sometimes. So we're trying to understand how, we're learning a lot about just basically filling out a questionnaire form can be an othering experience. Like a lot of those forms just say male and female, and there's a lot of people we know who don't identify as either. So that already makes someone feel like an other. Just simple things like that. But then also the larger practices of who's included and who's not included. And so we're focusing on learning a lot about and trying to change the environment of our industry to make it more equitable and more inclusive and really take a critical look. I think a lot of times in industry, we're moving too fast to really consider those really important, very important topics. So I'm really happy to work with that organization, and we're bringing what we learn into our practice.
That's fabulous. Abby, where can people find out about TrimTab if they're interested in finding out about the services you all offer?
You could go to our website. It's wearetrimtab.com. And you can find us on LinkedIn, and we have a Twitter account too.
Thank you so much for coming by, Abby. We really enjoyed talking to you and learning more about user experience research. And if you would like to find out more about either TrimTab or Abby, you can go to wearetrimtab.com, which is billed as a people-centered design agency, or find them on Twitter at twitter.com/wearetrimtab. This week's episode of the FOSS-Pod was produced by Braden and Will. That's us.
For one more episode, I think.
We got to figure out a better way to. Oh yeah, this will help itself next week.
This will work itself out.
It's edited by Sabrina Hill and is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. And you can find out more about Google Open Source at opensource.google.
It's kind of a mouthful.
It's a lot to say, it turns out. We have a bad user experience here for me as the user who has to say this every week.
Getting mouth, oral muscle memory, you'll figure it out.
Another 30 or 40 episodes, it'll be no problem. But that'll do it for us this week. As always, we'd love to hear what you think about the episode. You can send an email to fosspod@content.town or hit us on Twitter at the FOSSPod. We welcome all feedback in the interest of making this a better user experience for everyone.
Nice.
And we'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we will talk to you real soon.